So imagine you're in architecture school and you are developing a thesis that is going to transform an entire block in a major city like San Diego. And that ends up being realized and actually being built. Then at a young age, you go off and build an incredible award-winning architecture firm. Well, that's exactly what Philip Auchettl did. And he is on the show today to tell us all about it, talk about becoming an architect developer, what that looks like, what the different stages of development, how to get projects realized, and also talking about starting this process at a time when he was just finishing school. It's an incredible story. It's super inspiring. After we got off, I already was like taking notes and had all these ideas. So I know you are going to find so much value in today's episode. Philip is the CEO of RADLAB, which is an architecture firm here in San Diego that works on projects all over the country. From early on in his career, he knew that he wanted to do architecture and development. And so he's approached his projects with that in mind. He works with clients, but now they also have projects of their own, including a major project in Waco, Texas, which we dive into a little bit. His firm has gone on to win tons of awards. He also won the Young Architect of the Year award in San Diego just a couple years ago. And his story is really inspiring for emerging professionals and anyone who's looking to kind of take control of their architecture journey and show that it is possible to have success, to do it at even a young age, and to really have fun with it. So let's get into it. I know you're going to enjoy today's episode, so let's get started. Hey everyone, today I have on with me Philip Auchettl from RADLAB, and you just heard a whole bio before, so I just want to get into it. So hey Philip, how you doing?
Very well, thank you. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. And I've known of you guys for a while because when I actually went to new school and when I came in for orientation, you guys were presenting your thesis. And so it was like this, like, oh, this is really cool. This is possibility of what we can do. And also your thesis was built, and that's where I had happy hour during my whole, school process. So I want to dive into a little bit about that, like getting a big project built really early on, starting a business, an architecture firm from a young age, which, I did as well. And a lot of people have a lot of questions and, it's inspiring to a lot of people. So just chatting about that. But I'd love to start off kind of telling a little bit of your story with architecture, that journey into architecture, and then also that process of starting or getting your thesis built, I guess. I know that's kind of like a long form question.
No, that's okay. Yeah, totally. So how I got into architecture, I guess I was always interested in architecture, but I kept getting pushed away from it for one reason or another. And I ended up actually doing my undergrad in visual art, and I was doing painting as a major, and I ended up being a traveling artist for a number of years and doing shows around between Australia and London and America. But I ultimately got kind of bored with it. And the next step for me was architecture. I just always figured that was the next practical step, but then also the next big challenge. I thought, for me as an artist, it was always like, okay, well, you're creating something on a canvas that, people are supposed to have this emotional reaction to, but how can we do that when you start creating a building and people are stepping into a space and you're getting that same reaction? And it's the same thing on a much larger scale, and it's much more fulfilling. And that was sort of like my push into architecture. And then, as you said, went to New School of Architecture. I went into architecture knowing that I also wanted to do development. So I was looking at development pre-architecture, then figured if I could do the architect as well, I could sort of kill two birds with one stone and be my own client as the ultimate goal. The thesis that you mentioned, I also figured that if I was going to spend an entire year working on one project with collaborating all of some of the, top minds on the architectural business and the architectural world, I guess at least within San Diego, why not do something that can A, have an impact on what's happening in downtown, and B, if I'm using all those people, why not try and do something I could actually build? That was sort of the theory there.
Yeah, that's so smart because it's practical. It's like you make it's something that you can be working on, but then also it's like you're basically working while getting a degree for it. It's That's perfect.
Yeah. And if, and the way I figured it too was like, look, if I was to go out just by myself and start saying, okay, I'm going to figure this out to design and build a building, you're not getting all the support and the backing of a school who's sitting there. And that, obviously the thesis has to be a thesis that's more than just building a single family home. But I thought it was definitely a good way to take advantage of the situation I was in. The thesis ended up being, this was just after the recession. So there was a lot of empty properties. So we really looked at saying, okay, why are there all these empty vacant pieces of property? When I say we, I actually did a thesis with a group of 3 other students. We were able to do that at that point on the assumption that we were actually going to build something. That was our selling point to the school. But the thesis ended up looking at these empty properties and saying, look, there's all these parcels across the city that are not only privately owned, but publicly owned. And everyone had plans to ultimately develop it, right? But nothing for the next, 2, 4, 5, 10 years. That's where we realized that the city of San Diego was also in a similar situation where they had all these empty properties with no immediate future plans to do anything with it. So we said, look, this is owned by the city. It's therefore community owned. So it should be activated for the community. Why not do a temporary development as a placeholder to get ready for that future development? And that sort of in a nutshell was where our thesis courtyard was born and where we actually ended up using shipping containers as the main building infrastructure for that project.
Yeah, so I have a couple questions about that because, first of all, knowing that you wanted to get in development, I have a lot of questions about that too, but I have too many segues I want to go. But funding, I want to talk a little bit about funding because this is especially when you're a student, that's a big undertaking, even thinking about the financials and all that stuff. So, it had to have been probably part of your thesis, right, of the funding and how that would even be feasible.
Yeah, we were fortunate that we had one of our professors was also a developer, an architect developer. Before the thesis year, we actually took a class, architect as developer at New School, which was super helpful. During the thesis, I just reached out to friends and tried to get connected as much as I could to other developers in San Diego. I think that's one thing that you can certainly do as a student is use that student card and play that student card. Say, hey, look, I'm a student. I'm just trying to learn all this sort of stuff. And people surprisingly just open the doors for you. So I had a couple different mentors, not just within the academic side of things, but also outside, which I ended up sort of doing some part-time work for, more or less volunteering for. But they were able to then teach me some of these things of how to put together a performer, what it takes to create a new company, why you're creating a new company per project, what you'd have to do if you're creating an architectural company, all that sort of stuff. But you're not wrong. When it comes to funding a project, that's always going to be the biggest thing, especially at that point. It was myself and a couple other students. We're just all a bunch of poor students. One of our partners was living in a buddy's closet by the end of the thesis year. But what we actually did was interesting. I don't know, do you want me to sort of go into that process of what we did there?
I think it's helpful, even if they're not a student, even if they're interested in starting development and all that stuff. Yeah.
So sort of the backtrack to sort of start at the beginning there, how we were able to raise that funding. Our thesis was, we ended up approaching the city with this whole concept of wanting to create this public-private partnership and activate city-owned land. And that's step one, right? You got to get the property, or you got to have at least tie some property up. We knocked on the mayor's office. He loved the idea. At that point, he was doing come meet the mayor tell him a story or tell him whatever you want or why there's trash on the streets or what you're trying to do for 2 minutes, right? So we went and did that. We stood in line and one morning and went and spoke to him. He's like, great, this is an excellent idea. I love what you guys are doing. Gave us, he's like, told his staff, connect these guys. And they obviously didn't. So we ended up going back, knocking on his door again. This happened about 3 times until ultimately he was able to connect us with the right people at the city. Long story short, he put us in a room with all the right people and said, no one leaves until we've got a solution here. Don't say no. So he saw the value in it, which was great for us at that time. We then were able to secure a property that was about 3/4 of a city block in the downtown San Diego. We had suggested because it was also designated the problem corner in downtown San Diego with the police department. It was a vacant block, just nothing but trash, light, vagrancy, drug dealers hanging out in the corners that were always getting busted and whatnot. So we thought we would take actually that challenge on as part of our thesis to start to actually turn that into a community space, which really just falls back into the whole broken windows theory. So what we did there is we said, great, we've got this concept, we've got this property. We then put together all the pretty pictures and whatnot of what we could do there. And then what we did is we actually put up a big sign on the property, or multiple signs on the property with a bunch of Sharpies, and it just said, what do you want here? So that was an exercise we did to see if the community would react and engage. And we thought that we weren't sure what to expect, to be honest, but within days, the whole signs were filled. And we had an overwhelming amount of responses. And there was things like, weird things like snake pits and football stadiums or whatever. But for the most part, everything just sort of pointed back to an outdoor place to gather and socialize. And that's what we really took from it, which is why then ultimately we ended up creating Courtyard, which was a combination of a dog park, because there was always supposed to be a dog park promised for there. That was something that was always, people were always asking for. We did a dog park, we did a beer garden, we did restaurants, we did spaces, food trucks, we did live music, we did retail, all that sort of fun stuff. Put right there in the middle of the area. We put a coffee shop in the corner with the dodgy area where the drug dealer was hanging out. We found the most out there, flamboyant, hula hooping, bubble machine coffee shop guy we could find to go right there on that corner. And then all of a sudden, again, goes back to the broken windows theory. The drug dealer is no longer comfortable hanging out there. And this used to be a place where people would either just not walk to or just put their head down and walk by.
That's such a good point too, because it is right across the street from New School, and that transformed that entire area. Like, I didn't feel as nervous walking by there, or I could go hang out there. I brought my dogs there often.
Right. I love that.
And I mean, it's crazy. I went down to that area like a year ago, and it's completely different than what it was when we were there. But Courtyard really kind of started cleaning up that area in a way, and bringing community, and also bringing community out to even that side of East Village where it was like a border where people didn't even transfer over. And so I love that there's so many great lessons in here, is involving the community, not doing just what you want to do for a design. As architects, we need to involve all the stakeholders. So we're designing something that they want, not just what we want. And then also getting support and help from other people. It's not about us trying to put our head down and do everything ourselves. It sounds like at each step of the way, you weren't afraid to ask, hey, I need help, or how can I do this? But also take risks. I'm sure that there could be a lot of imposter syndrome that could come up in situations like that, where it's like, well, I couldn't even do this anyway, so why even try?
For sure. And I mean, I think it was almost like we're also just naive and didn't know any better. And I think that was worked to our advantage. But once we got the city and we had this concept and whatnot, we obviously, like you said too, like, where do you get the funding, right? You've got this great idea. The city thinks it's great. The city's telling us they're going to give us a lease on this property. We've started to put together work with the local community groups. We reached out to every single community group, that from East Village Association to Downtown Partnership, to everyone, just to get letters of support too, just for the project. And then came the funding. And what we ended up doing was a little unique. We actually did a Kickstarter because we knew that we needed money to at least get through the permitting phase. And we figured if we could get through the permitting phase and get this and get the legal documents created with the city, that would be enough to then go to be able to have a package and go out and find investors. So we actually managed to raise $60,000 in 30 days.
Wow, that's amazing.
That was strictly through the local community. We created our own dodgy video on Kickstarter, and we went and put flyers up. We went and spoke to everyone. But essentially people got t-shirts and, tickets to the opening event and stuff like that. But for the most part, it was pure donation, because people wanted to see something happen in that area. And it was, we really were pushing it as like, this is your city block, so let's try and make something of it. And that was huge. And that was validation to us that it was needed there. And it's what's interesting about that, it actually came down, we had a $60,000 goal, and if you don't reach it, you actually get nothing. That's how Kickstarter works, within the 30-day limit or whatever limit you put to it. So it came down to the last 4 hours before we were closing. We were about $13,000 short, and we're like, oh, we were so close. We're at the pub and we were just like getting lunch, and we're like, oh my goodness. And then we had a $15,000 donation, and we called the people, or emailed, I don't remember at the time, but we either called or emailed. We got in contact with whoever it was, and they said, look, we were just granted we were given a grant for $15,000 to do some sort of public improvement. We think what you guys are doing is beyond that, so we thought that it'll be in better hands. And then that was what got us up and rolling.
That is insane that it was like almost to the number exactly what you needed.
Yeah, incredible.
And you can't like, that's why sometimes it's like, if you have big dreams, just start and do it. You can never imagine how it's necessarily going to happen, because random stuff might just be thrown at you. That's so crazy.
Yeah. So that was good. So that then we got our 60 grand. We went through permitting. We went through, got all our legal documents done with the city. There was all sorts of hiccups with that, but we got through it. I think at the end of every day, my buddy and I, my business partner, would essentially just finish the day and be like, well, that might be it for today. We'll fist bump and I'll see you in the morning.
Oh my gosh. But and I've heard too from other architects that San Diego's jurisdiction is one of the hardest ones to get permits in. It's really one of the only ones other than San Diego County that I've worked in and can be a nightmare. So I can imagine that that's like, there's nothing like learning how to start and run an architecture firm, like just being thrown right in like the dog pit of trying to get those permits. I would assume they maybe tried to help you a little bit, guide you, or
you would assume. So we had to go through, well, firstly, because we're using shipping containers had only ever been done a couple of times at that point, especially in California. They were not very common like they are now. Not that they're common yet, but they're certainly you see them more often. So there was a project up in San Francisco that had done a small shipping container project. So we actually ended up having our engineers sit down with the city of San Diego engineers, and we all called the city of San Francisco and told them, convinced them that a single story shipping container isn't going to fall over, all that sort of good stuff. So the permitting side of it was like its own thing. We ended up actually permitting through the state of California as commercial modular units. So that way it made a simpler process actually going through the city. So the city didn't have to pull permits and inspect the actual units themselves. They just saw them as pre-approved modular units. The bigger challenge was actually working through the legal side of it and the city. And at that point, it was Civic San Diego, CCDC, Civic San Diego at that point. But securing our lease, we put together a whole draft and a whole document. The city then came back at one point. They switched over mayors. The city came back and said, all right, now we have to completely restart your whole legal document again, all that sort of good stuff. So yeah, we had some hiccups. And then obviously we went out and started raising money through investors. We were able to get investors that believed in the project, I think. And, I don't know, we probably spoke to, I can't even tell you how many, 100 people, different investors and just friends and family, and as many people who we could really just sit down and pitch the idea to. You get used to people saying no a lot, but for me, that just, I don't know, that kind of drives me anyway to say, well, you know what, fine, I'll find someone else.
Figure it out.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we were able to raise the money, and we did a sort of unique business model with that one because we actually ended up having the tenants come in and pay for their own shipping containers because we used containers at that one. So that actually did save us a bunch of capital. We still spent about $1 million on everything else, which is what we had to put together with investors. But otherwise, the tenants paid for their own containers, and the whole concept was that they then owned them. So when it was time to move to another location, they had first right of refusal to come with us, or they could go somewhere else.
Yeah. So I'd love to dive into the shipping containers because it's interesting. In 2000, like probably 9, when I was in undergrad, I did a project on shipping containers, and I remember it was just so new and kind of like exciting at that point. And I can imagine, like you said, not only like the permitting, but there had to have been a lot of, and I think even maybe still a lot of questions of, can this be done? Is it worth it? Can we actually save money here? So we can dive into a lot more of that, but I'd love to hear kind of that process of using shipping containers, maybe any challenges that came with that. Maybe in the long run, would it have been easier to not use shipping containers?
That's a great question. It's funny because even with with Courtyard, right, as our thesis project, we didn't want to do containers to begin with, which was sort of funny. We were like, you know what, shipping containers have been done. This is a thesis. We're so innovative and whatever. Like we're going to come up with a new cool thing, which we didn't. And we tried, but ultimately we were pushed and driven back to the containers because they just made a lot of sense for this type of project. For a project that's going to be there for 2, 4, 5, 10 years, like Courtyard was, containers just made a lot of sense. We were doing single wide things. It was an economical way for us to do it. You don't save a huge amount of money. Like, it might say online and, people think they build a house for $20,000. That's not accurate. But the container made sense for us for that project. For some projects that we do nowadays, it doesn't make sense. It really depends on where it's located. Can you ship containers there to begin with? Is it in a rural area where you're going to have problems getting up a hill? Is there power lines in the way if you're trying to crane them off the back of a truck? All that sort of stuff comes into play where the modular really makes sense. We ended up sticking with modular for that project. That was really a big flag in the ground which then sort of spurred our whole architecture firm. And we've done shipping container projects across the country since. And for some projects it makes sense and some it doesn't. Sometimes people just want a container project because it's a cool factor. Some people want it because it's sustainable you're using a recycled material, obviously, with the container. There's a surplus of shipping containers in the United States, and you do get them relatively inexpensive for what they are. But at the end of the day, that's what a shipping container is a container built for shipping. It's not built to be a housing. So when you do start modifying them and using them for a project, you do have to structurally reinforce them, all that sort of good stuff. And at the end of the day, it's just like, if you're doing a regular traditional build, you've still got to put in the same insulation, you've got to put in the same studs, the same toilets, the same floor, you've still got to put a foundation and bring utilities to it and all that sort of good stuff. And that's the big cost of the project. Does it save you a lot of money? Not really. Where we see it is saving is time, because you can build the units off site while you're simultaneously doing the foundation work and bringing utilities and all that sort of good stuff that you wouldn't necessarily be able to do if it's a traditional build where you're doing utilities and foundation first and then going up. So that's probably the biggest savings.
Yeah, that was one of my biggest questions, because, you still have the building science side of it where you have to make sure that it's insulated. So in my mind, you essentially have a shell. So maybe you have like an exterior finish, then you still use the same 2x4s or whatever you need, which then maybe encloses it even more. You still need to run all the proper things. So when I think of it, I kind of think of it like that. Like, is it really actually just a facade where you're now just building a typical standard structure within it in a way?
Sure. I mean, that is correct. It is ultimately a facade. And that's what I sort of tell people mostly is like, if they're wanting to use a shipping container, what's the reason? If you're doing it to save money, don't let that be your driving factor, because they are also restrictive. Shipping containers come in very limited sizes. It's typically an 8-foot wide by either 20 foot long or 40 foot long, 9.5 foot tall. We use the high cubes, which is 9.5 foot tall. We put them together, we stack them next to each other. We can open them up, all that sort of stuff to make them wide, put double wides, triple wides, whatever it is. You can stack them on top of each other, remove floor and the roofing and really open them up. But the more you start opening them up, the more expensive putting back into them. So it is a balancing act. And again, you've got to understand why you want to use containers and if it really makes sense per the project. We love using them. We think they're a great building block essentially to be starting with a project. But for us, if a project doesn't make sense with containers, we're very clear about that, and we know whether to cut it off there and do it as a traditional build versus using containers. So yeah.
There's certain parts of the country where it might make more sense to do a container versus other parts. I know you mentioned kind of topography, but what about actually regions?
I wouldn't say there's places where it makes more sense to use a shipping container over others, to be honest with you. There's certainly places in the country where it's easier to permit a shipping container project. There's certainly places where, so typically for California, for example, since we're based in Cali, it's what we do is like San Diego, if you look at the building code, actually does not allow a shipping container building, plain and simple. They're very strict about that. But what they do allow is commercial modular units or residential modular units that are approved through the state of California. So when we do a project in an area or a city or a state that doesn't allow shipping container modular units, we just classify them as state approved modular units. And we've never had a problem with the city with that. It essentially takes the liability off the city. They don't have to inspect the units, and they're just seen as, again, like you had mentioned earlier, the shipping container ultimately is just a facade of that modular unit.
As you mentioned, if you're building off-site essentially, and then on-site you're doing, the foundation, whatever utilities in the foundation, are you actually building out the whole interior off-site as well? So that's simultaneous, or is that once it's in place?
So typically we'll build it all probably 95% complete off-site. We're doing one right now we talked about earlier in Waco, Texas. That one's a little bit different. That's all being built on-site, but that's sort of a unique situation in itself. But typically we'll build them 95% complete off-site while we're doing foundations and utilities often take a while. You got to bring in power and all that sort of good stuff. So if we have the time to do it off-site, we do. And then we bring them on if the shipping containers are, double wides, if there's, we're opening them up and whatnot. There's the finishings and sealing them together and all that sort of stuff on site and waterproofing. But otherwise, yeah.
Are there any special considerations that you have to take for like the detailing when you're doing it? Like you mentioned waterproofing, which is fairly typical when we're designing like our wall systems and our roof systems. Does that constraint add any extra details that are needed?
It does. Typically what I'll tell people if they're wanting to do a container project and if they reach out to us is whether you use us or someone else, use someone who has used an architect, use an engineer, use a builder if you can, who has done a shipping container project in the past or who have that expertise, because it's not rocket science, but there is a lot of nuances that come with using a repurposed metal box. And we've learned all these things over the years that we can streamline it, but we've seen it too many times where clients have just hired an architect or engineer and all the above who have said, yeah, we can do this for you. It's no big deal. We'll figure it out. And they ultimately end up figuring it out on their dollar, on the client's dollar, and it ends up costing a lot more. And we've had to come in and have fixed buildings and have, try to save projects that were done incorrectly. And sometimes we've seen them where it's not salvageable, and it's a really unfortunate, but it's a loss, and it's a loss to the client.
Wow. Yeah, and that would not be ideal. Is it like because I know that, you drive up the 5 and you see all the shipping containers in Long Beach area and stuff. Is there just like, there's certain areas where there's a ton just sitting there, and so it's pretty easy to actually obtain them?
Yeah, so Port of Long Beach is a big one, but there are ports obviously across the country. But what ends up happening is, typically these ship containers are built in China. They're shipped over, and they're shipping a lot more stuff into America than what we are shipping back to China, right? So it ends up actually being more economical and cheaper for the company over in China to actually build a brand new container than it is to ship back an empty one. And that's why we end up with a bunch from over here.
Yeah, and I mean that, and a sustainability aspect of that is huge, because otherwise they're just sitting there taking up space, I mean, again, when you drive by the port, you can see just crazy amount of shipping containers. So ideally, if you can reuse those, then that's perfect.
Absolutely.
Crazy. So if there's anyone who is listening who is maybe thinking of designing or bringing in a shipping container for their own project, do you have any just last thoughts or words, advice for them, other than definitely getting professionals who know what they're doing in that aspect?
Yeah, I would ask yourself, I guess, like I said earlier, like, why do you want to do it? If you're doing it for the cool factor or marketability factor, then yeah, absolutely, have fun with it. But again, just make sure you are in contact with a company who has done it before. Make sure you can see that they've done it before and they're not just telling you that they have. And then, that's the basics of it.
That brings up actually another question, because you say marketability, and I can imagine that it might be more advantageous for like a commercial company or something to do it maybe for that marketability or sustainability factor. Do you find that it is more commercial properties or projects that you're doing rather than residential?
Yeah, it's for the residential side of shipping container homes. Typically, what we see is if people are doing it for Airbnbs. Otherwise, if someone wants to live in the container themselves as their primary home, we've done that before. It's just a very unique client typically versus the commercial. We've done anything from, we've done a 50-room boutique hotel we're doing right now out of containers. We've worked with some of the larger corporations like Taco Bell and Walmart and Sonic and built buildings for them out of containers, just again as a marketability thing for them. But for us, and we're doing a project in, like I mentioned earlier, in Texas. I mean, that's 28,000 square foot of shipping containers. That includes retail and event space and restaurants and bars and all that sort of, and a hotel. And that's, if it was just built out of stick frame and stucco, it loses some of that cool factor and some of that wow factor. And, people aren't talking about it like they would be, I think, when it's a container project. So yeah, from a marketability standpoint and just that simple cool factor, that goes a long way.
Yeah, it's definitely more unique and something to like go venture and see in order, because it is more unique. So that makes sense. Okay, before we sign off, just selfishly, because, I run an architecture firm, the goal is development. I didn't take that class at New School, which I'm kicking myself. I don't know why. I feel like it maybe wasn't offered, or I didn't know. I know that when I would go to Courtyard, I'd see that you guys had your office space basically there, which I think was genius. Like take a space there. But I'd love to just chat quickly about starting in that, like starting your architecture firm. And because you guys have come so far, you do like the project you just described. That's a huge project. And so maybe what learning lessons you had from the beginning to now, because that's been like, what, 8 years now?
Yeah, Courtyard's anniversary is 8 years, like next month. So,
wow. Yeah. So what's been the biggest learning lessons or starting and growing a successful firm?
Starting and growing, overhead is going to be your biggest killer to start with. I mean, like you sort of mentioned, we had all of us working in a shipping container to start with. We had one 40-foot by 8-foot wide shipping container with 7 or 8 of us working in there at one point, because that was, part of, we had the opportunity to build our own project. So we had zero overhead on the rent side of it because we were using our own space there. But any way to minimize that is going to be key. And we really just, when you're starting your own firm, as you know, what everyone wants to know is, what have you built, right? I mean, I mentioned that earlier. I was like, don't use an architect who hasn't built a shipping container, right? Like, how do you get someone to give you that trust to do that first project? We pretty much took on any project we could when we first started. And we did a lot of we were doing labor ourselves. I think, I remember we were like painting roof tiles, like to go up at ceiling tiles, like to help with like a tenant improvement for a restaurant building. We then, I think through putting yourself out there and connecting with as many people as possible, we were fortunate that, our first residential project was actually one of our investors who invested in Courtyard, right? Because we had created that relationship already. So we ended up building his $7 million custom home out in St. Thomas, Virgin Islands, on this cliffside that was right on this perfect, pristine, private beach. And he gave us a lot of creative freedom, and we were very, very lucky. Like that was
not a bad first project.
No. And it's absolutely a phenomenal project. And, and he was a great client, right? But then we've had clients where we've just taken clients and, where it's not the ideal client like that, right? Most clients are not going to be like that, which for us, we learned the hard way that most clients are like that. And what I would say too, to that point, is some clients will try to screw you over. We had a few instances where clients just, would take the work and then just not want to pay us, or they would ask us if, hey, can you guys put together a concept design for us, right? And initially, you're so hungry for new projects, we would do that for people, but just do it knowing that it is possible that they could just take that concept and hand it to another company and say, now I want you to do this. So just be careful. But ultimately, it's the best thing you can do. I love it. It was able to push us into doing our own development. We're currently developing a 100 units multifamily project in San Diego. That's traditional build. It's not necessarily a container project. And then we are doing another container project that is ours as our architect developer. We're actually doing architect developer and builder. So that one in Waco, Texas, and that's going to be a 28,000 square foot, a dozen retail spaces. There's an old existing warehouse we've rehabbed. We've got 21 hotel rooms. We've got a couple of different event spaces and like 4 different restaurants and bars, five, I think, which is a huge step from where we started with, taking on people's bathroom remodels. Yeah. And we're very fortunate. We feel very fortunate that we're able to get there. But it really does take just that leap of faith. And, people are going to tell you can't do it. But if it's something you really, really want to do, you just have to push forward.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because I have people ask all the time, how do you get that first client? And it's like, what you see us doing now is not what we were doing in the beginning. I remember one of my first projects, it was literally like new paint and finishes and like a new closet in the bathroom. Like, it was not glamorous at all. I don't use it for my portfolio, but it started that process. You start learning. And also the other thing I say too is, if I would have gotten the projects that I have now in the very beginning, I would have not known what to do with it. I would have made a lot of mistakes. I probably would have been sued a bunch. Like, there's this progression that is needed. And so it's easy to look at someone who's been in business for 8 years and be like, oh my gosh, I want that now. But it's like, you don't see all that work underneath or in the past that has built up for that.
Yeah, it takes time. It takes time.
But also, finding the right clients, and also even putting on your portfolio renders or just the projects that you want instead of all the projects.
Absolutely. And you sort of nailed it there. Like, if you have projects that are just like rendered projects, you can put it on your portfolio, you can put it on your website as, conceptual. It still shows whoever's trying to hire you, or whoever you're trying to have hire you, what sort of creative direction you have. And one thing too you can do also is partner with other architects, right? And other designers. We did that. We've done that too. When there's a project that, like you said, if a project came in and we weren't necessarily ready to take that type of a project on, we might bring in another architecture firm who's done it before, right? And just say, look, hey, we're going to work with you on this. We're going to take a much lower fee than, you're going to take. Maybe it's a 50-50, maybe it's a 75-25 or 10%, whatever it is that you need to hang on to, but then giving them the rest for you to gain that experience is actually very important too, because then moving forward, you can put that in your portfolio to say, hey, here's the project that I've done. And collaboration is also key.
And you learn from it. Awesome. Well, okay, I ask people all the time, when you're not designing or running a business or all that good stuff, how do you like to spend your time?
I love to travel. I'm also very fortunate that with my work, I do travel quite a bit, but I thoroughly enjoy traveling with my family when I'm able to get away and take the kids out and all that sort of good stuff. But yeah, I'm from Australia originally. I grew up there. I traveled around Europe when I was younger, made my way to America, traveled around America, and it's always just been just something I thoroughly love doing. And honestly, I always recommend that to especially architects, but absolutely. But as an architect, it's architect and a business owner, get out there and travel and try and meet with people. You're doing a fantastic job with these podcasts, because I think it opens you up to meeting all these different people.
Oh yeah, it's I get to learn from so many amazing people every day, and travel is also great. Yeah, because you get to see different architecture, see how different cultures live, and it really helps open up your creativity. So that's awesome. Cool. Well, okay, where can people find you? Maybe if someone wants to hire RADLAB, or if people are just curious about your journey, where's the best place?
Website or Instagram. Website is radlabsd.com, and our Instagram is @radlabsd.
Awesome. Easy. Thank you so much, Philip. Appreciate you being here. And excited excited to see your projects. I'm excited to see the Waco project. I've been kind of seeing the progress of it, and it's awesome.
Yeah, pleasure. Good chatting with you.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you all so much for sticking around and listening to Philip and I's conversation. So many great nuggets from that conversation. Just very inspired and motivated. And yeah, even though I do run my own firm, now I have all these ideas for like where I can go next and where I can take it. And I'm so inspired by not only the ambition that Philip and his other partners had, but also their involvement with the community and their vision of what could be, where architecture can increase the value of a community and bring beneficial connection and clean up communities. Like there's so much to it that I'm so inspired by. I love the altruism behind what architecture can do and how it is a beautiful piece of art that people can embrace and be in and enjoy. And it really did make me proud to be an architect, because I know that listening to that episode, I was in my mind thinking, dang, that sounds cool. I want to do that. I want to be an architect. And then I'm like, oh yeah, I am. And sometimes we need that reminder, right? Sometimes when we've been going about this for a while, or maybe you're in your exam journey, or maybe you're in school and you're going through a hardship, or your exams are getting tough, or school studio is just wearing you down. Remember that this profession has so much possibility, and it is really exciting and motivating. So I hope that you've found value. I would love to hear your biggest takeaways. So leave a comment, head over to Instagram, let both Philip and myself know. Go over to each of our Instagrams. We'd love to hear it. Thank you so much. Again, don't forget, subscribe so you can get more episodes like today. All right, have a good one, and I will see you next week. In the meantime, you can check out this video next.